Welcome. I'm Kimberly Taws from the Country Bookshop, and on behalf of the bookshop, I want to thank you for being here and take a moment to talk with you about the bookshop before we begin our conversation with Eric Weiner. The Country Bookshop was founded in 1953, and we exist still today because you choose to buy our books with us. And then we can bring great ideas and authors to your attention, like tonight's conversation about Ben and me in search of a founder's formula for a long and useful life. The Country Bookshop was in danger of closing our doors 14 years ago, and the award-winning Pilot newspaper stepped in to invest in our community because they believed it was important to live in a place with a bookstore. Every time you buy a book with us, you are agreeing that it is also important to live in a place with a bookstore. I want to thank you for that, and also thank you for joining and watching this today. Eric Weiner is an award-winning journalist, the best-selling author, and speaker. His books include Geography of Bliss, The Geography of Genius, Man Seeks God, and The Socrates Express. His latest book, Ben and Me, is what we are here to discuss today. It has just been published by Avid Reader Press, and his books have been translated into more than 20 languages. He's a former correspondent for NPR, a reporter for the New York Times, and a regular contributor to the Washington Post, BBC Travel, and Afar, among other communication publications. He lives in Washington, D.C., and we are speaking with him today from Miami, where he has just had a great in-person event at the famous Books and Books. So we are pleased to have you here with us, Ben. I did it again, Eric. Thank you for being here.
I don't mind being confused with Ben Franklin. It's nice to be with you, Kimberly. And that's an amazing story about the Country Bookshop. And thank God for independent bookstores like yours. Seriously. I mean, they're a blessing for authors like myself and for the whole country. So keep doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And for everybody listening, it's because, and I mean what I say, it's because people shop with us. It's a choice. And that's why we get to do cool things like this. I jumping in, but what books can do and how this isn't where I wanted to begin the conversation, but when you began that way, I mean, it comes through over and over how books connect people and ideas. And reading your book, I was reminded how Franklin used books as
Right.
such a connection tool, not just ideas, but with
Right.
people.
I was going to say that he really lived through the book and lived for the book. You know, he only had 2 years of formal education, and yet he was so learned. How he went to the school of Ben, I call it, or the school of the book, and those were his, teachers were Aristotle and Plato and the contemporary writers of his time. And he read books, he printed them, published them, edited them, and he lent them to people, and they often did not return them. So, and he would try to track them down. So I thought that was like a modern problem, but it goes back to the 18th century, lending books to friends and they don't return them. So yeah, Ben Franklin self-identified as a printer all his life, even when he was wildly successful and famous. And if there was one object that he loved in life, it was the physical book. No ebooks for him. No.
No ebooks for him, although I'm
Right.
sure he would love the practicality of traveling with them.
Yeah, I think he would, but I think he also had, he had this technological bent. He was very much a futurist, but I think he also loved the physicality of a hardcover book, and he took great pains as a publisher and printer to make his books aesthetically pleasing, something
Mhm.
you want to hold in your hand. And one thing I discovered researching this book, Kimberly, is that books printed in the 18th century are far more durable than those printed today. In fact, the paper was sturdier and acid-free, I believe, and they would, you know, I've been in touching books from the 18th century, and they're in pretty good shape. So I thought that was quite interesting.
One of my questions that I think I deemed not high quality enough for our conversation, but you talk about his needing a new journal and how he could wipe away the ink with some water. It was a brief mention, but it made me even more curious about, would the journals have also been made of the same paper,
I
like
think
his writing
so.
style?
And they were quality, and he loved a good notebook. I happen to be a notebook person. I have a bit of a problem in that I have way too many like high quality, really nice tactile notebooks in my house. It's an issue. But Ben also loved a good notebook. And what you're talking about is an experiment he did. We're kind of diving in here to Ben in as a young man, where he tried to improve his life and get his act together and achieve what he called moral perfection, kind of a high bar. And he came up with these 13 virtues, everything from temperance to silence to chastity. And he was going to try to follow them. And he devised a notebook grid system where every time he strayed from one of these virtues, he would put a mark in the book. And he thought it would be easy because he knew what the right thing to do was. And turned out he wasn't nearly as virtuous as he thought he was. And so he had to erase the black marks and get a new notebook because there were holes in that one. So yeah, notebooks, and he carried that notebook around the rest of his life. Not quite as diligently tracking his virtues, but he always had it with him. Even when he was in France as a man in his 70s representing the US, French friends commented on, oh, he keeps his notebook with him to track his virtues or his failure to stick to his virtues. So yeah, he was a book person and he was a notebook person, and he loved the feel of printer's ink and the smell of it. And like I said, he signed his documents often B. Franklin Printer. That was how he self-identified.
It's interesting. Your book um, is organized into character chapters, but it is also chronological. And I was struck when we're at the part of the book where he is in France in his 70s. You talk about how you thought that he couldn't have done this job as a younger man. He couldn't have done this job
Right.
um, until after this life of betterment and thinking and
Right.
experiences.
Yeah, I
Um,
call that chapter full Ben because he brought his full game to the court, if you will. Um, you know, I know the age of our leaders is and potential leaders is something in the news right now. And I think it's interesting to look at Franklin, who, you know, became an American rebel at age 69, pretty late. Represented the U.S. in France in his 70s, and was not in the best of physical health, but was sharp mentally and had acquired the wisdom that you really need to be in, I would argue, the most important diplomatic position that any American has ever been in, ever. And there was
right.
no foreign service, there was no State Department yet, there was no real embassy. He worked
And
at
we
a,
wouldn't be America without him in that position,
we would
arguably.
not be right. We would not be the U.S. without him. I say in the book, and I think this is true, that after George Washington, he's only second to George Washington in winning the Revolutionary War for us, because without French support, money, and arms, George Washington's Continental Army would not have had what they needed to win the war. It was crucial. So he wasn't on the front lines fighting like Washington was, but he was fighting a different kind of battle, a diplomatic battle. And it was the perfect battle for him because, let's face it, he was charming. He was a flirt too. And he also was very empathetic. And so he could see the world through French eyes. And any good diplomat needs that skill set, right? That set of that empathy to be able to see, you're representing the US in Italy, you need to see the world from through Italian eyes or Indian eyes or wherever you are. And Franklin had that in spades.
I was struck. I know we're bouncing around so much in the book, but around in that time in France, that the Adams were there, and I enjoyed your book so much. I did not lead with that,
Thank
but
you.
I really did. But I enjoyed where you contrast Abigail Adams and the Adams were there
Yes.
at the same time to less success, and you really highlight the rigidity versus, as you say, Franklin's
Yeah,
ability.
so John Adams was posted there for a while with Franklin, and his wife Abigail joined him for a while. And they were uptight New Englanders, let's be honest. John Adams, a very smart, educated man, and a great man in his own right. But he would see Franklin, you know, dining late into the night and drinking with the French, starting his day at 11 a.m. or noon. And Adams is like, we need to have breakfast meetings. We need to get all this done. And this is not the way to conduct. This is so disorganized. This is no way to run an embassy, de facto embassy. And what Adams failed to see is what Franklin knew is that you meet the French on their own terms. And business was not conducted over the breakfast table in France. It was conducted over the dinner table and in salons and in musical concerts held in people's houses and in late night jam sessions over a few bottles of wine. And the French foreign minister, a man named Vergennes, would have nothing to do with Adams. He refused to meet with him. He found him just disagreeable. And he did meet with Franklin, and they became sort of partners in this effort to convince the king, Louis XVI, to back the American cause, which, if you think about it, the Americans were fighting to essentially overthrow or kick out a monarch. The king of France is a monarch, and, of course, that did not end well for them with the revolution, but Franklin was so good at convincing people that he was able to convince the French, that it was in their interest and in humanity's interest, because he aimed high, Franklin, to back the American cause.
It is so beautiful reading your book because it almost feels it is this tapestry of things we know about Franklin, but Franklin becomes, because of the way you're engaging with him and reflecting on your own experience, revisiting all these places that Franklin went to, you're meeting us where we are learning about
Yeah,
Franklin and
that's a good
exploring.
point.
And I found the symmetry of that really, really beautiful, because we get to follow you as you're going to England and Philadelphia and Boston and France and holding the books and walking the land. And really
Right.
that the intimacy you're experiencing, we get to experience from today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that you clearly get the book, and that means a lot to me, seriously. I will say that in the beginning, when I set out to write this book, I knew I did not want to write a conventional biography. Those exist, and some of them are quite good. I wanted, in the book's called Ben and Me for a reason. So I'm not writing about Ben Franklin so much as encountering him, having a relationship with him in the present, and, putting myself out there. I do write about myself and my struggle with depression and other issues, um, because I wanted to write the kind of book that Ben Franklin would want to read or publish, even maybe. He as an editor and a writer, he valued brevity, um, he valued honesty, and he valued humor. He was also a big traveler like myself. He logged 42,000 miles over his life, crossed the Atlantic 8 times. So I wanted to write the kind of book that he'd want to read, and the kind of book, to be honest, that maybe someone who would never pick up an 800-page standard biography of Franklin, or would never even pick up a history book necessarily, would want to read this one. People ask me, like, what's your target audience? Well, it's everyone, of course, as any author would say, but also I would say really it's not the typical person who would reads these doorstop biographies, 1,000 pages on Ulysses S. Grant, that sort of thing. But people who are curious about Franklin, and I can't tell you, when people asked me what I was working on, I said, "Oh, I'm writing a book about Ben Franklin." Like, their eyes would light up, like, "Oh, Ben, I love Ben," or he was naughty, wasn't he? They really honed in on that. And as I say in the book, Jefferson and Washington, they have scholars, but Ben Franklin has fanboys out there. And I was really struck by that, because he is, as I say, the least dead of the founders, the most alive.
I love that. And and when we're encountering these people in school for the first time, and I love the cover because he does of Ben winking, because he winks at us from a dull book, like a school book, even
Right.
like the flatness he does.
He is, yeah, that's a line I borrowed and noted from Walter Isaacson in his biography. He says Ben Franklin is the founding father who winks at us. And I think our
Right, you have it
graphic,
as the epitaph.
graphic department took that to its logical conclusion. And it's true because he had this mischievous quality and he didn't take himself too seriously. He took his work seriously, but not himself.
Well, and I think, and I'm scrolling down, one of the you talk about writing a book that Ben would have wanted to publish, and just this spherical weaving of Ben from then into your experience today, and by nature us. But I started writing down, I called them the modern Ben phrases, because at this point I had morphed you into Ben Weiner instead of
Maybe
Weiner.
I think I might have a name change, you know?
I mean, well, you do, but
Yeah.
you were starting, it seemed to me as a reader that some of your conclusions and reflections were becoming beautiful and eloquent, like we have this phrasing from Ben. And I know you've studied through your past books, philosophy and everything else, so this is very obvious, but some that struck me, and I'm going to call attention to them and then ask, well, actually, there are too many for me to really
Mhm.
read aloud, but talking about soul places don't coddle, they make demands of us. Support is most effective when it is invisible. Ben never muzzled his ignorance. He cared a lot about appearances, not as a substitute for authenticity, but an augmentation. Um, Speed may be seductive, but it's during life's slower moments, it's intermissions when genuine breakthroughs become possible. There's so many of these, and I'm curious about how this experience was for you. Another thing, and this is more, I'm going to lead you into your response a little bit. Um, I think you were walking in England. I'm not sure, but you talk about walking along a path, tracing his footsteps, and then you see this church.
Right.
Can
Yeah. So
you?
this is the Isle of Wight in southern England. It's an island, and Ben was a young man when he was there. He was 20 years old. He's had just had a kind of year abroad in London as a very poor printer. It's all in the book, the story of it was his great, awful, terrible adventure in London. And he's going home, not sure what he's going to do with his life, to be honest. And the journey's taking a really long time, and the ship is just the winds are not cooperating. It takes him like weeks to get out of the English Channel. The ship goes backwards at one point, and so they have a stopover at the Isle of Wight, and he walks around, and he didn't always do this, which kind of annoys me, but on this trip he kept a journal, a very detailed journal, journal of a voyage it's called, and I had a copy of it in my hand, and I'm walking around the countryside, and Google Maps or Apple Maps don't work very well in the English countryside. It's just the signal's not good. It befuddles them. So I'm using Ben it was actually exactly 300 years ago. You know, it was 1724 when he was on this island. And I'm walking around and he's describing in great detail what he sees. And he says, and then I came across a church, and sure enough, there is this medieval style church, a very, very old church. And there was something about that moment when I felt like, wow, Ben is right here with me. He's guiding me on this journey. And, and I realized also that the church was old when Ben saw it. He's like, I can't read the tombstones or yeah. And so it somehow closed the gap of the centuries. And, I felt connected with him. And I had a number of those experiences researching in the book.
It's really beautiful, and you close the gap, I think, for the modern reader reading your pages as well as you're walking the floorboards, and also um, bringing the little things. Here we have this huge figure who ultimately, and I want to talk more about this, we need to remythologize, but also talking about lost luggage, which you mentioned that was a problem then too, like these practice.
Yeah, as a representative of France, one of his duties was to deal with Americans and their lost luggage. And I'm thinking, I thought, what did he get redirected to Cleveland? I mean, but it happened. And then when we're jumping ahead here, but he's leaving France. He's about 80 years old. He's going back to Philadelphia, and his luggage gets lost, and it takes months to catch up to him in Philadelphia. And I thought, wow, this is so it's a little things like that that I try to excavate in my research. The humanizing details and the details that close the gap again, that close, because there's a distance, just like there's a distance between us and the people of China, the cultural and physical distance, there's a distance between us and people of the past. An English writer famously said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And it's true, but just like we can visit a foreign country and get and become connected with the people there, I think we can visit the past and become connected with the people. And it's not necessarily through the big, bold ideas of the time, but it's often the little details like lending a book to someone who doesn't return it, or lost luggage, or all kinds of things that make you realize that people are people wherever they are in the world, and in a way, Kimberly, whenever they are in the world too.
I agree with you, and you mentioned your vulnerabilities that you bring up, and you again, I was struck by some of the things you talk about, specifically to me, how we get along with your wife and ways that you cope, and you reflecting on how you are in your family. And it seemed particularly interesting that when you talk about a device you use to work with your depression, and that honest curiosity about yourself and your willingness to share it mirrored so much of Franklin's honest curiosity and
Yeah. I mean, my philosophy in all my books, but I think especially in this one, is you have to have skin in the game. If Ben's going to lay himself out there, which he did to varying degrees, we can talk about that. He wore many masks, but he did put himself out there, and more than I think the other founders. He was less stiff. If Ben's going to do it and I'm going to write about him, then I feel like I should do it too. And by writing about my depression or my tendency to talk too much or whatever it is, my foibles, I feel like I'm extending a hand to Ben and extending a hand to the reader, saying, I'm not the expert from on high telling you what you need to know about Ben Franklin, although I did a ton of research, and you will get a narrative arc of Ben's life in this book, from beginning to end and end to beginning. But I wanted to be human myself in order to humanize Franklin.
I have a few random questions.
There are no random questions.
Well, you mentioned that he became a vegetarian in part so that he could save money to buy books. And
Right.
then a couple times you mentioned his hilarious writing where he's having a conversation with his gout. And
Yes.
I'm curious, and it says like the meat was known to cause gout in that
Right.
conversation. And I was curious, what did people think about meat at that time? Like, it had not occurred to me. Like, I know how we kind of talk, how I talk about meat and vegetables with my friends, like as a lady of 2024, but I was just
Boy,
curious what you
that's
know
an
about.
interesting. Boy, I haven't had that question.
I told you
Well,
there.
no. So that is a random question. I take it back. There are random questions. So let's
I'll
talk
bring
about his vegetarianism. So um, he picked up. See, he really latched onto these books again. Comes back to the book. So he's a young man, he's a teenager, growing up in Boston, Puritan Boston, and he picks up this book called, I think it was called The Way to Health. It was actually, written in the 1600s by an Englishman, and it's an early um, advertisement or promotion of the vegetarian lifestyle. And first of all, I found that interesting. I didn't know that, in Europe, at least, that vegetarianism was a thing, and apparently it was. And so Franklin said, I'm going to try that because then it'll cost less money and I can buy more books. And it didn't last that long, I have to say. So then he runs away from home at age 17. and he's got no money. He's on the ship sailing for New York and doesn't know what awaits him. The ship, again, uncooperative winds. They run out of food. They have to fish overboard, and they catch all this cod, and the cook is frying it up, and it's sizzling, and it smells so good. And Franklin's like, no, 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 I'm a vegetarian. I can't. Then he notices little fish inside the big fish, and then he says, well, if that fish can eat other fish, why can't I eat it? And then he says something quite remarkable. He says, isn't it a wonderful thing to be a rational creature? You can reason yourself to anything. So here he is, very much a man of reason during the age of reason, but he recognizes that we can trick ourselves into convincing ourselves. Sometimes it's called confirmation bias, and he was always aware of the limits of rational thinking. So that's one interesting aspect of him and meat. I know when he was living in England, he liked venison from the US, and his wife Deborah would send it to him. He did enjoy a rich diet, which did lead to the gout, which was caused by rich diet, lack of exercise. But also when he was younger, and we don't really have portraits of him as a really young man, he was fit. In fact, he was buff. I could have had a chapter called Buff Ben. He lifted weights. He was a boxer briefly, and mainly he was a swimmer. He's the only founding father inducted into the International Swimming Hall of Fame up the road here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And this was at a time when most people could not swim, even sailors couldn't. He essentially taught himself in Boston how to swim. And when he went to London and as a young man, and he's swimming across the Thames River, people are amazed at this. And one like aristocratic gentleman offers him a job for lots of money, teaching his children how to swim. And thank God he didn't take that job and went back to Philadelphia. And that's when he made a name for himself, where he'd be the swimming instructor we've never heard of.
I was struck and kind of grateful for where you kind of give us a little bit of Cotton Mather in a different light. Because I think about like Salem witch trials and in a very condensed, general, flat way that we tend to
Yeah.
look at.
And not a positive way, let's be honest.
Yes, not a positive way.
Right.
Like I think about him like testing girls in the water to see if they sink or swim, and the Salem witch trials and in all the things. But you give a, I've moved away from where I've written this question down, but a really interesting perspective about how reason and or rationality and faith. I
Right.
mean, you say he's curious because he wants to glorify God's ways, but I really enjoyed um, getting a. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah. So we have, I always, when I'm researching a book, remain open to the possibility that my preconceptions are wrong. And like you, my preconceptions of the Puritans in Boston was that Salem witch in the Massachusetts Salem witch trials, um, guys in pointy hats who are not a lot of fun
Not nice.
and not nice. And partly that is true. Boston at the time was a sort of semi-theocracy. There was the Puritan church was the only game in town. But some of the best science of the time came out of Puritan Boston, conducted by the Puritans. Cotton Mather, who was a reverend, was also the most learned man in Boston with a library of some 4,000 books. He also really knew a lot about medicine for the time. And so there's a smallpox outbreak, several actually, in Boston. And there was a new inoculation, sort of primitive vaccine that was available that we now know works. Same principle as many vaccines today. You're exposed to a little bit of the virus. And most of the official doctors in Boston were against it. Cotton Mather thought it was a good idea. So I think the point is, and Franklin said we should learn from everyone, even our enemies. Be kind to your enemies for they show you your faults, he once said. And I think one thing that made him so brilliant is he could engage with Cotton Mather, read Cotton Mather, and extract the useful parts from his ideas and discard the parts that he, Franklin, had no time for. The more conventional Orthodox religiosity that and the church politics that Franklin had no time for. But he could see the good in anyone and extract that. And today, so I'm going to bring it back today, we tend to be like, oh, that person is a Republican or a Democrat or a churchgoer or not a churchgoer, so therefore I have nothing to learn from them. And we shut ourselves down and we deprive ourselves of a lot of wisdom, I think, by first looking at the messenger and then maybe later looking at the message.
I think it also goes to, and I think we mentioned this earlier, but his ability to flirt and to bring out that good because he sees it in someone, bring out that good in people and get stuff done. And I'm reminded about how you described in the book how he got the hospital built
Right.
and how he uses that ability to see your good streak or your
Yeah, more than that, I would say he did believe in the fundamental goodness of people. And his God, if he had one, he says is powerful goodness. He worshiped powerful goodness. I love that term, powerful goodness. And he thought if you treated people as if they were good, they eventually would be good or at least better. And he sort of tricked people into being more generous, better versions of themselves. And I'll give you that, put some meat on the bones, speaking about meat, to what you mentioned about the Pennsylvania hospital. So it's in the 1750s. There's no hospital, no real hospital in the colonies at this point, certainly not in Pennsylvania. And a doctor friend of Franklin says, we should build a hospital. Doctor was a great doctor, terrible fundraiser, didn't know how to do this. And Ben's like, okay, I'll get on this. He loved the challenge. He writes these anonymous editorials in his newspaper. Didn't put his name on it because maybe some people don't like Ben Franklin, but just saying, wouldn't it be a great idea if we had a hospital in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia? And here's why. And then next step, he goes to the assembly, the parliament basically of Pennsylvania, and says, hey guys, if I can raise 2,000 pounds, the currency they used then, will you guys match it with another 2,000? And they said, sure, because they thought there's no way. There was a lot of money back then that Franklin was going to raise that. And as Franklin puts it, they thought they could appear generous without having to be generous. Of course, Franklin raises 2,700 pounds, goes back to them and says, check, please. And they did pony up. And he had just invented the matching grant, which is still used today, of course, and which is a technique to, I don't know how any other way to put it than to trick people in a positive way into being more generous than they might be otherwise. And Franklin was not beyond using what I call helpful deceit in order to achieve this. And he was very much a trickster that way, but in a very positive way.
I was fascinated as you talk about you do a little bit of Philadelphia compared to Boston as he goes when it's a very young city, only 10 years old,
Right.
and um, that the spirit is different there, that it's fun.
Yeah, it was the place to be in the early 1700s. Not New York. New York was much more of a backwater. Boston was big, but kind of big, 8,000 people, right? But it was uptight compared to Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the sort of California, the Silicon Valley of the day, the place where no one asked any questions about where you came from or what your family name was or want to know what can you do. And it was founded by the Quaker William Penn, and he really did want it to be. He called it a holy experiment. He wanted it to be a place where people of all, at least Christian denominations, and there was also a small Jewish community there, where there was much more religious tolerance and people had more freedoms. And they did. And compared to, it's all relative, but compared to Boston, and I'm convinced that that was a pivotal key moment in Franklin's life, was leaving the place that was not really the place for him, Boston, and skipping over another place that was not for him, New York, and landing in what I call your soul place. Your soul place, in my mind, is where you know you were meant to be. And just like you can have many relationships in your life, but only one soulmate, you can visit many places, even live in many places, but have only one soul place. And for Benjamin Franklin, Philadelphia definitely was his soul place. He left many times for years or decades at a time, but always came back to what he called my dear Philadelphia.
It just in that sentence and also in the book, and we talked about the reality of his longevity of life. Reading your book, the reader is reminded that he did spend like 15 years in London later.
He spent 2 years as a young man and another 15 or 16 years as a much older man, now successful, pretty famous scientist in his 50s. And he's sent there on what he thought would be a 6-month assignment, a mission to represent Pennsylvania and then other colonies. And it was a strange mission because, what I learned in history classes, the founding fathers and mothers just rose up all at once. And it was not a straight line like that. For most of his life, Franklin saw himself as a loyal subject of the British Empire. When he said he was going to London in his 50s, year 1757, he said he was going home to England. Long story short is over the course of those 15 or so years, he becomes increasingly disenchanted. He really wanted to keep it together. He hated confrontation. He saw it as a family dispute and sort of like the child who sees their parents fighting and doesn't want them to get divorced. That was sort of how Franklin saw this relationship. And there was one moment in 1774 where he's called before the king's cabinet, the Privy Council, and it's all the posh people, anyone who's anyone in London is there, and he's dressed down by the king's solicitor, and he's called a thief and the prime conductor of all the troubles between Britain and her colonies, a bad man. And Franklin just sits there poker faced for an hour or so and doesn't show any emotion.
And everyone's laughing
They
in
were
your
laughing, they were jeering, they were laughing and jeering, and it must have been humiliating, or he must have been angry, obviously. Um, and I'm convinced, and many historians agree, that when he walked into that room, he walked in as a disillusioned but still loyal British subject, and he walked out an American rebel. And if you think about it, like changing your mind at age 69 about something as central as that, it's a big deal. He had more to lose and less to gain than any of the other founders. And I mean, that's one thing I admire about him is his intellectual flexibility, even especially as he grew older. Most of us become more set in our ways. We've seen people like this, maybe, family who just, this is the way it is. Uncle Donnie's not changing his mind, whatever it is. And Franklin changed his mind about democracy, about slavery, became a vocal abolitionist late in life. And I think there's a lesson there for us, a positive lesson.
I there's what I wanted to open with, and the joy of a conversation is that I did not is towards the end of the book, you call on us to remythologize Benjamin Franklin.
Right.
And you talk about how we need myths and give a shout out to Joseph Campbell. And I think this is really interesting and important. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and a little bit.
Yeah, and this is a conversation that if we were having it 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, probably would have been very different. So at this time in American history, I think we there are two camps when it comes to the founders. The people who put them up on pedestals and say they could do no wrong and worship them essentially, and the people who find them to be deeply flawed men, and they were men, who deserve to be canceled. Let's call it as what it is. And I take a middle view, which is they were deeply flawed, but who among us is not? I mean, if we only could learn from our historical figures who were perfect, we would learn from no one. Um, Martin Luther King Jr., great leader, terrible family man from all the historical accounts. Mahatma Gandhi, who I've written about in the past and very fond of, um, amazing leader, spiritual leader, leader of his nation, India, terrible family man, not a great husband, not a great father. Um, Ben Franklin also had his flaws. Not a terrible husband, but not a great husband. Tortured relationship with his son William, which we can talk about. Um, Not a perfect man at all, but there's a lot to admire in him. So I think remythologizing means myths are, as you know from Joseph Campbell, are they're not just falsehoods. That's the way we use the term today. Oh, that's a myth, meaning it's just a lie. No, a myth is like the animating story. It's a story that we tell ourselves. And as Americans, we need any culture needs myths. Otherwise, why do you get out of bed in the morning? What do you care about? And we have pretty good myths about, democracy and about freedom and about possibility. And the founders are wrapped up in that. But let's remythologize them. Like I give you an example, like Franklin and doubt. Here's a man who, at the Constitutional Convention gives a speech celebrating doubt. That would be a way to remythologize him, and say, here's Ben Franklin, the great doubter, founding doubter, or just looking at their flaws honestly and saying, yeah, he did own seven enslaved people during his lifetime as a middle-aged man. But as he grew older and saw the immorality of slavery and saw its destructiveness to both slave and slave owner, I should say, he changed his mind and he doubted himself. So, let's I'm trying to avoid the cliche baby in the bathwater because I hate cliches, but that's essentially what it is. And let's look at them as humans and not as perfect statues.
I think to me, that's the most interesting, one of the more interesting parts about this call to remythologize, because um, perfectionism and the way it exists today, and obviously, we're dealing with somebody who lived with Puritans as well. I mean, there is, Adams and Franklin are were characters of America then and are characters of America then. And
Yeah.
um and
Yeah, no,
I
we are the descendants, and you see some people who are more Franklin-like, some people more Adams-like or Jefferson. It's not we are different, but we're more alike. We're more similar to the Americans of the 18th century than we might think.
it but I love the idea of I think perfectionism is a real problem, or just this idea that it is a that just this as a concept. I could talk on this, I think, because I think it's just
I'm going to jump in because Franklin does use perfection sometimes in his writing, like his plan for moral perfection. That's what he called it. And he was a young man. He's going to follow these 13 virtues. We were talking about the Notebook in the beginning. Now, when I read that, I'm like, wow, moral perfection. That's a high bar, Ben. And it would try telling your friends now you're going on a plan for moral perfection. I mean, if you said you were trying to lose 20 pounds or get in shape, they'd be like, great, but moral perfection, well. So Franklin tries it, fails, but he says it's still instructive. And I think his approach to perfection is interesting because he was actually much kinder to himself and his faults in a good way. So if he made a mistake, he didn't see it as a sin. He didn't even see it as like something he had to beat himself up about. He called it an errata. An errata is an old printing term, I think still used today in some quarters. That means a mistake. It's a typo, say, in a book. And almost every book still published today in the first edition contains some errata, some mistake. What does the publisher do? The printer. They don't like say, "Oh my God, I've sinned. This is awful," and beat themselves up. They fix it and release a new and improved second edition. And Franklin thought, why not do this with ourselves? You make a mistake, fix it and release a new and improved edition in this lifetime, and you could just always release new editions. There were some parts of his life, like his relationship with William, where he, I think, failed to fix the errata. But it's an interesting approach to, when you mess up, to just say, oh, That's an errata. I'll fix that in the next edition. It's a shift in mindset that, I wish I could do. I tend to be hard on myself when I make mistakes. And that's one of the lessons I learned from Franklin in a personal way is, oh, it's not a mistake. It's an errata. It's a typo. We'll fix it next edition.
I also think it's just this moving toward, it's like this act of moving toward. And I think, as a country, are we moving toward betterment? As a human, are we moving toward a better version? Um,
I
that
mean, I call Franklin a possibilian, borrowing the term from Dave Eagleman, neuroscientist and author. And I think he was a possibilian in that he always saw what was possible in the future. He once said that he regretted that he wasn't born 100 years later to see all the scientific and technological advances. I mean, I wish I was born 100 years earlier when you could really explore the world, but that's another story. And so he was a futurist in that sense, like the sort of most Silicon Valley of the founders, but he also knew where he came from. He was rooted in history. He, was looking through the windshield, but he was checking the rearview mirror now and then. And I don't know, I don't know what you think. I think we're still we're still an optimistic country. I know it's easy to be negative about everything that's going on, um, but there's still an optimism and being we have more possibilities, I think, still in America than you see in other countries.
I think so too. And I also think, this conversation, your book, everything else, I think the middle is an inarticulated group. Uh,
That's
first,
well put. Yeah.
first of all, and second of all, even the two extremes, they see very different possibilities, but they're each possibilians in and
Yes.
of themselves.
Yeah.
And then, and on this point, um, I loved how, in the book, you talk about how Franklin understood government, which was the compromise, not like it was a stark contrast into the way it's.
He was a great compromiser. As I said, he despised confrontation, and wanted people to get along. It's that simple. And so he had friends that he disagreed with politically and religiously. I mean, he was not a churchgoer. I think he was a spiritual man, but he was not happy with the church bureaucracy and hierarchy. Yet he had friends like George Whitefield, leader of the Great Awakening, a very charismatic preacher, another preacher named Shipley in England. He could, as we would say today, reach across the aisle. And he accomplished this in several ways. One is with his language. He was saucy and provoking as a teenager, he said, but then he realized that got him nowhere. So he would use softer terms. He wouldn't say, this is the way it is. He would say, it appears to me, or it seems to me. He would keep the door open. He also was a great listener, and avoided what he called talking over much, which is a great term, I think. So he was a great listener. He had that empathy, which is, I think, essential for compromise. And he played a key role at the Constitutional Convention at age 81, Joe Biden's age, not that much older than Donald Trump, and in crafting what's called the Great Compromise, the division between the House and the Senate, so that the small states and the big states could agree. And yeah, he didn't always get what he wanted, but he was, I mean, that's the very definition of a compromise. So yeah, we could use, someone the other day asked me, like, who is the politician who's the closest to Franklin today? And I said, I can't think of one, and that's the problem, is we need more Franklins, I think.
We need more humor. We need somebody winking at us and having a sense of humor and diffusing the situation. I love how you talk about um, the ocean of research he had done before he understood about diffusing electricity, the
Right.
way he used humor to diffuse these tense
Right.
situations
So
throughout
the
his life.
lightning rod is his most famous invention. He had many, but you think about how the lightning rod works, it doesn't defeat lightning, right? It doesn't conquer it. It deflects it, distracts it, like over here. No, hit over here, not that building. And that we use that expression today. Someone who would be a lightning rod, and that was his so his science, his electrical science, and his politics actually informed each other. They weren't just like separate parts of Ben Franklin. Like he he used his business sense when he was doing his electrical experiments. Positive charge, negative charge, battery. These are all Franklin's terms we still use today. He thought like a business person and applied it to electricity. And then he took the what he learned in electricity and applied it, I think, to his diplomacy and his politics. And we could talk about this for an hour, but I feel like we're just too much in silos today. Like we get on these tracks as a, I've got a 19-year-old daughter who's going to be a sophomore in college, and she's got to know what she's doing now. Franklin didn't know what he was going to do at 19, and he could be a scientist and a politician. He could be all these things because he was brilliant, but also because it was permitted back then.
The age of the amateur,
Age of
as
the
you said.
amateur. Yes.
You talk about your daughter, you reference her in your several times in the book in your grappling with Franklin's relationship with his son. And I have thoughts about that, but can you, for anyone who's might be listening who has yet to read this book, which everyone definitely should, it's the perfect, I used the word that I don't like, but it is the ideal summer read this year,
That's
2024.
not a bad thing, is it? I mean,
My own thing, but
yeah.
talk about his relationship with William. And
So I said he wasn't perfect, and this is a place he definitely was not perfect. It is, I think, the saddest chapter in his life. So he has a son, William. We don't know who the mother is to this day. Deborah became essentially his wife, became the stepmother. Historians have no idea who the mother was, but Franklin raises him. He's his son, and Deborah does too. But he's raised under much more posh circumstances than Franklin was raised. And he was very much enamored of the British and the British Empire, as many Americans were. He never switched sides. He was the last royal governor that is appointed by the King of New Jersey. He's thrown in jail in Connecticut by the American rebels for a year or more. And William's wife writes to Ben, his father, and says, please, please get your son out of jail. Ben does not. And they were on opposite sides of the war. The war ends. William reaches out to his father and says, essentially, I did what I thought was right. You did what you thought was right. Let's make up. Franklin's not having it. Ben Franklin. He says, and is of the 15,000 letters that he wrote or received, this I think was the most heartbreaking. He says to his son, yes, you did what you thought was right, but there are certain obligations, natural obligations, he called them, of a son to his father that are the most important in the world, and you violated those. They had one last brief meeting in the south of England, very tense, very cold. We don't know what happened. Franklin gets back to Philadelphia from France and revises his will and writes his son William out of the will. And he says in his will, I am depriving my son of the fortune that he attempted me to deprive me of. It's sad because Ben Franklin had a great capacity for forgiveness. He forgave his brother for mistreating him. He forgave the British for fighting the war. He could not forgive his own son, William, for siding against him. And I think it's shows his humanity, and it's often these family relationships where that are the most difficult.
I have thoughts about this, and I know we're
Okay,
nearing our
go
time.
ahead.
So Deborah, who was like apparently a business genius and major abolitionist,
Yes,
but she is William's stepmother, and they were close. And Franklin's away when Deborah dies and is not.
right.
And William, this is all from your book, by the way, my
Yes,
conclusion. And William was not pleased with the way Franklin behaved to this woman who William, I would imagine, has not just who has like extra respect and love for because she's taken him in,
right.
and so he's extra defensive of her. And then I think you talk about how Franklin's ego evolved over time, and he's always every 20 years he's goes back into a betterment thing. But I can only imagine what it would be like to be the son of a man who takes up so much space everywhere he goes. And your
Yeah, that's a good point. And he was famous. He's the only founding father who would still be famous even if there was no revolution, right? Because he was famous before for his electrical experiments, especially in France. Oh my God, he was a rock star in France and in England to some extent. So I think, any child that has a famous parent, it's got to be hard. And I think it was hard for William. You want to be your own man, your own person. And
here's this way to do it. It's the only way to do it. What an opportunity. And my thinking is that the way Ben kind of took William's son as his grandson and like
yes,
has this relationship with him.
right.
I found that interesting. And also the grandchild would revere you the way the whole world reveres you, and your son can't because your son knows your flaws so deeply.
Yeah, the son always wants to get out of the shadow of the father, and Ben
Yeah.
Franklin cast a very large shadow. That's a good theory. I like
It's
that
like,
theory, and I have a theory of why Ben Franklin never finished his autobiography. It
okay, tell
ends
me.
it ends when he's, I think, about 57, just when life was getting interesting. And it wasn't only because he didn't have the time. He was busy, but he made time for other things. The autobiography begins with these words, "Dear son." So it was a
Mhm.
letter, began as at least that was the technique, a letter to his son William. And I think returning to it when there was this break in the relationship, when they were estranged, was too painful for him. Couldn't continue that as a letter to his son. Um, I think that's possible as well.
Hmm. It is fascinating, and we started a little bit into the hour, but it is an hour where I've taken your time. And is there, before we close, we have one attendee who's not related to me, so I appreciate it. Live, and mostly this conversation will go out everywhere we can send it to get people really excited about this book. But unless Marilyn, who's attending live, has any questions,
Hi,
uh,
Marilyn.
is there anything what do you want to leave us with? What do you want to make sure that whoever's listening to this or watching this takes
Well,
other read the book and
yeah,
buy it from
right.
the bookshop,
Um,
but
yeah, well,
conceptually?
I mean, it is not I'll just be honest with you, as a writer and writer to bookseller, people like to put books into slots, into categories. Is this biography? Is this history? Is this memoir? Is this travel log? Is this self-help book? And my book, Benemy, is a little bit of all of that. It is a hybrid book. Um, and I think that's positive, genre busting, but people need to figure, you need to read a little to get that. And that's the challenge. But Franklin was genre busting. Was he a philosopher? Was he a scientist? Was he a statesman? Was he educated? Was he a man of the people? Was he elite? He was all those things as well. So it's a hybrid book for a hybrid man. Um, but just circling back to the subtitle, In Search of a Founder's Formula for a Long and Useful Life, that was his North Star, being useful to other people. And I think we give lip service to being useful these days, but we also say things like, "Oh, Kimberly, your friend Susan, she's just using you," right? Like that's a character flaw on Kimberly's part. She's allowing herself to be used. I don't think Benjamin Franklin would see it that way. He would say basically, "Yes, I'm here, use me. I'm a candle burning for just a few decades. I want to burn down to the base and be and emit as much light and heat as I can and be as useful as I can." And I think that's an important lesson for all of us right now in the year 2024.
That's very interesting, and I love you leaving us with that. I think about uh who I want to hand this book to, which is a lot of people coming in, but also Ben Franklin. There's a piece in all of us who thinks of ourselves as an intellectual. Everybody wants to be a little bit of the best parts of Ben Franklin. I think that's why we all remember him winking at us from our textbooks. And
Right.
I think that's that's the part of every person who walks in the door who I'm going to sell this book to is don't.
Yeah, and he was an intellectual, but he was also what he called a leather apron man because the printers wore these leather aprons. It was blue collar of its day. And that's what's amazing about him is he was so learned, so self-taught, but he was still B. Franklin printer, and he could talk to the dock workers in the harbor, and he could talk to King Louis XVI, who he met at Versailles, equally.
I just love it. Well, Ben, oh my gosh, I did it again.
I am going to change my name to
From the
Ben.
beginning to the end, I am completing you.
It's a
And you know,
compliment, Kimberly. It means that I've imbibed him.
well, as exactly as you said, as you've traveled to these places and really been able to bring Ben forth, um, I'm really appreciative of that night. I want to thank you not only for that, Marilyn's mentioned something here, but also for taking the time to speak with me and allowing me to do everything I can to get this book and your ideas and Ben's ideas into as many people's hands as possible and brains as possible.
Thank you, Kimberly. I loved your questions. I loved your relaxed Ben-like way of talking to. And it was our conversation did not go in a straight line, but I still think it went somewhere. So
Story of my life.
there you go. Thank you. Happy July 4th and be well.
Thanks, Eric. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.